prego, vi imploro, con umiltà e con fiducia, permettete a Cristo di parlare all'uomo.
Don Gius aveva capito il problema che avevo. Se la tua vocazione è vero, il tuo lavoro verrà fuori anche dai sassi.
Di comunicare la fede agli altri, ma veramente insieme a loro riscoprire che cos'è la fede, che cos'è la fede per me. Portare Cristo agli altri, comunicarlo agli altri è l'unico modo che abbiamo per conoscerlo veramente.
L'iter communionis aiuta a comunicare all'esterno la ricchezza di vita, di giudizi, di tentativi, di opere che nascono dalle persone e dalle comunità. L'iter communionis è proprio la vita del movimento. Scrivete all'iter communionis le vostre esperienze, ci fate bene.
Vi prego, vi imploro, con umiltà e con fiducia, permettete a Cristo di parlare all'uomo.
Don Gius aveva capito il problema che avevo. Se la tua vocazione è vero, il tuo lavoro verrà fuori anche dai sassi.
Di comunicare la fede agli altri, ma veramente insieme a loro riscoprire che cos'è la fede, che cos'è la fede per me. Portare Cristo agli altri, comunicarlo agli altri è l'unico modo che abbiamo per conoscerlo veramente.
L'iter communionis aiuta a comunicare all'esterno la ricchezza di vita, di giudizi, di tentativi, di opere che nascono dalle persone e dalle comunità. L'iter communionis è proprio la vita del movimento. Scrivete all'iter communionis le vostre esperienze, ci fate bene.
Questo è un luogo che genera dialogo,
Qualcuno che si impegna, che si batte.
che approfondisce la conoscenza e sostiene la fiducia. È un crocevia dove si incontra chi desidera il vero, il bello, il giusto e il bene. È una testimonianza di speranza nel cuore ferito del presente. E tutto questo
Proporre con la propria vita.
esiste anche grazie a te.
Good evening, welcome. This is a meeting organised, done quite a while ago with by Tempi and the meeting room. Yes, yes, no, no, the risk of education. Here's Domenico Airoma, the public prosecutor of the Court of Avellino and vice president of the Centro Studi Livatino. Livatino is a name that those who come to the meeting, it brings up some memories. A few years ago here we did an exhibition which recalled this judge killed by the mafia. The Livatino Study Centre is a study centre very important, and for a while we invite them frequently to express, and they express very clear judgments on things about news, things that are happening in our society. Then Giancarlo Cesana, who those who frequently come to the meeting will know him well. He's the Professor of General and Applied Hygiene at University of Milano-Bicocca, and as well as being a great educator who has brought up, as they say in Brianza, hundreds of thousands of young people, including myself and my own children. And I'll say this only to realize what kind of continuity and faithfulness that Giancarlo has had in this educative task of his, which I think we should all be very grateful for. Giancarlo has just published a book called the 78 Scenario, and we'll maybe talk about it later. Finally, Don Maurizio Patriciello, Don Maurizio, a lot of people at the meeting people are very welcoming. Don Maurizio is the parish priest of Caivano, and maybe he'll explain his story to us. So, starting from Airoma, I'd like to ask you to tell us, above all, the situations that you see. First, before we were discussing this a bit around the table, and he told us about the difficulties that he sees in his area, particularly the young people. He is a magistrate. He comes across a lot of difficult situations, and in front of these situations, the problem comes up, certainly to ensure that people respect the law, but also, as he'll say, to have a educative, human way of looking at people that he meets, that he sees. Please. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to start and talk above all about the difficulties, because there's the risk in education, but in my sector there's the risk of re-education. What I have to work with is, above all, with the youngest people, is that in some way it leaves me unquiet, it disturbs me, and ever more frequently the delinquency doesn't have a clear reason. It seems if there's a teaching that in my 40 years of this work, that I try to understand what is the motivation behind a crime. and this could maybe people commit crimes these days without a reason. It seems violence has its own aim. And very often, fairly often, parents don't realise, and they say that that's my son, that person there. In reality, it's very true today that our children are much more children of their time than of their parents, and we live in this time that's soaked in this idea that there's no such thing as good and evil, and yet I often say, my job is to see evil. I see it in action. When there's nobody who speaks to young people of good and evil, that they should do this, don't this, and what to do about evil. How often in school that they say, I know how this guy's going to finish. I know how this film's going to end up. I can tell you. And I also want to bring in my time to talk about good, if I can, how it can win. I've got no big claim that maybe some of my colleagues might have had of a certain left-wing socialism to kind of impose rules and a program of education. That in reality there's no re-education program that would help if somebody doesn't take it to heart. And so the Pope also said we've written laws, but we also need to discover. They need to discover it. It's a journey of discover that this individual, we can't replace them. We can help it. We create the conditions for it with a personal and human relationship. And I'll tell you a couple of stories. The first one is that of a young mafia guy, a Camorra guy. He was one of the most heavily looked for killers in the area, and he decides, for various reasons, even out of fear. He came from a damaged family, and that there's all kind of explanation about marginalisation and his roots and so on, and that for many criminals this isn't true. It's not true. In reality, this young guy, he decided to become a Camorrista because he was looking for reasons, and nobody had ever helped him, been a point of reference to him. He sees evil, he experiences it in his family, and he decides to leave the clan, and so then he started to collaborate with justice. I recall. This guy had a wife and kids and a lover, so he had to make a choice. He said, I said, make a choice, but leave your lover and stay with the wife. And so clearly he went into protective custody with his wife and children, and then he phones me when he was already protected and said, my wife's expecting a child. I said, great, that's very, very good for you. He said, we'll baptize the child. You need to come as well too, because we'll call him Domenico after. So that this is a journey that surprised me, because it's not simple when you find a criminal in front of you. And Maurizio will know. He's also had in front of him rapists, people have thrown a child off the balcony, and Domenico knows all this kind of thing. It's very difficult for these circumstances to think of that person in front of you as a human, but you must never lose this trust, because there's an aspect that maybe we pay for with the young people if we don't give them trust. If we think that they're no longer able to have their own story, to have something to do, to make their own choices, their freedom, fundamentally, even responsibility. So I'll recount a second story. I was talking about it this afternoon. Another Camorrista, not a young guy this time, he's getting on in years, who he was responsible for 30-odd murders. He calls me because he wanted to speak. I say, well, what do you want? You got 30 murders. Well, that's not a lot. I don't know what can I do for you. But I go there to the prison, thinking that this thing would have lasted a few minutes, or if it maybe had a few complaints or something. And then I saw him, I was at the restaurant, and I sit there, and he says to me, you know I've done 30 murders, yeah? But I want to tell you about another 10, which you guys have never discovered. And I said, why? Why have you done this choice? I want to understand, because he'll benefit nothing in no way from this. So why does he choose to do this? He replies, for two fundamental reasons. The first is because I want to pay all of my entire debt to justice. And this guy, he was demonstrating to be fully re-educated, because in reality he'd understood how much evil he'd done, how much it was necessary that he should pay for the evil he'd done, for this debt that he had in the face of the community. He was in prison, but his soul was already outside, if you like, his spirit. And then he adds, I chose to speak to you and not with another of your colleagues, because you have always treated me not as a criminal, but as a man, as a person. Thank you. Dom Patriciello is here for the first time. He's a man whose note is well known, above all for the fact of living in an area that's sadly famous for the news stories about it. He was also very much at the centre of a question which in journalistic terms was called the land of fire. These 90 places where illegally stuff was dumped, and so he courageously reported on this. And in his area, in his village where he lives, very often people talk of, but because murders happen there, or drug dealing, violence, even children dead of overdose. And Father, until recently, and then we'll explain why, this place was considered the greatest drug dealing place of Europe. Dom Maurizio, he writes very well. He writes in the Avellino newspaper, Facebook, and he always does it in a very direct way, very frank, without too much wordage, and so clearly he speaks to the victims and also of their killers, who he often reports or denounces, but he also gives them a hand. He holds out a hand to them. Outside his parish, a bomb was placed outside, was exploded outside his parish church as a warning to him. And this shows that since then he's been living with a police escort. So I want to ask him this. There was a famous case a little while ago that's sadly well known, that had it centre two kids of 10 and 11 years that had been abused for many months by a group of minors themselves. And he, in an interview, says one thing that struck us at the time. He said the fundamental problem of this terrible fact was that we have abdicated to the difficulties of education. So I want to ask him, to Don Patriciello, what is this fatigue, this struggle of education that you're speaking of? So firstly, thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. I think that no one of us could say themselves the master of education. St. John Bosco said that educating is something of your heart. I realize this every day. And so as I was talking before with Domenico, and I said, many people go to a priest, mums, dads, and they ask, but where have I gone wrong in front of some situations? That they do an exam of conscience and ask themselves, where have I gone wrong? And often I find myself saying, we haven't made a mistake, we've done nothing wrong, you haven't done anything wrong in any way. The truth is that under our eyes, but we struggle to understand it, is that, and I'll help myself with some images, that if the education, if I can consider it like an orange with 10 segments, of these 10 segments in our hands, we've just got half of them left to us. The other half of the orange, and maybe more than a half, has been taken by these gadgets, which all our children, all our youngsters, and their parents, their grandparents, their uncles and aunts have in their hands. So this is a truth that is in front of our eyes, and we struggle to comprehend it, but it's enough, one little click, to arrive at a world which, until yesterday, was an unknown world. Speaking of the kids who were, let's say, raped in my parish a few years ago, this was a very strange case, and I realized that the journalists hadn't grasped the meaning of it, the sign that it was. I realized that they were speaking of a rape of 2 kids, but the problem was that the slaughters of these kids were themselves children. So really, they were little, they were boys and girls, and it wasn't so much a rape. It wasn't an isolated fact. There was no paedophile involved, but there was this group of young lads who, for a few years, had discovered sex, and they were playing with sex, and then because I don't know why, but we don't even go for a pizza if we don't record it on our phone, because it's not enjoying the pizza that we like, but the fact that others must know about it. And so this is also true for the kids and for adults. But these guys had started to film what they were doing, and these films passed from phone to phone, and in this way they got, in the end, into the hands of the captain of the Carabinieri, without realizing that somebody had actually reported this, and then something happened. Then it all kicked off, because we all realized that what had happened. But the principal question was, I realized that nobody was placing the question, which was, but these 9 and 10-year-old kids and these girls, where did they learn? Where had they seen how to do this, for us, bad things, in such an explicit and strong and ferocious way? And then I said to myself, and the response is rhetorical. They learned it from this gadget. And so, okay, but what can we do? If you write any word and everything comes out the opposite, well, how can we help these kids? So I went to the minister and talked about this, the Minister for Families, and I said, Eugenia, but let's try to do something to get some help to these kids. It's impossible, but you realize better than me that then we're getting into a world with the problems that are maybe bigger than us. And so I said, seriously, at 8, 9 years old, I had my first girlfriend, and I remember then the first heartbeats, first dates, first little kiss, first embrace. At least these guys, we've stolen, we've robbed them of this, and so we've treated them like this in a ferocious world, and we all know the fact, dear brothers, sisters, dearest friends, that we all know. We all know. We know it all. How often our kid is left alone in the straight after dinner, maybe even before dinner, left alone, and they isolate themselves. We all know this, and so the problem is very serious. But okay, is there a response? I'm sure that because from this orange we've just got half the segments left. We need to increase our attention. We need to increase. There's not much to do, not much to say. because thinking only about what happens at the people who in Italy, we've lost in Italy in this summer for road accidents. We call them road accidents, but so, yeah, it's homicide on the road. These incidents happened because adults were messing around with their telephone in their hand, and they were chatting. They were adults, and so these adults certainly are the adults who at home have got some little children, probably. And all this story, I think, calls us to rethink, to review, first of all, education, but also before that, to what are our beliefs, what are our expectations, our beliefs, our convictions. And so I was thinking, there's a Neapolitan proverb that sometimes I open what I say. And this means you can live even without having a deep motivation, but you can't live without having a person to love. And we Christians think that from this point of view, that we think that we're really lucky because we know who is that person for whom we must live, for whom we can live, for whom we can challenge the best years of our lives. We know who this person is. I think that in the gospel, I'm a believer. I'm a priest. I became a priest when I was 30. I wasn't in this seminary as a little child or anything. Absolutely not. I'd left the Catholic Church when I was a youth, and I found it again, thanks to an encounter that I'd done with a Franciscan father. And we are fortunate because in the gospel we find the ABC of what would, if we can develop it, that would be these truths, these deep truths. And so we could go and meet the world of youth like this. We speak of the world of youth, but it's actually our kids. And often the mum and dad, they think that's just a thing of their age, but then they discover that this child, like it was with these ones in my parish, instead, already for months they discovered this part of, if you like, this so ferocious, explicit, strong, bitter, painful thing that marked them and has marked them for the rest of their life. Don Patriciello, thank you, sir. You were the guest at an event that we do every year in the honour of our founder Luigi Amiconi, who died a few years ago. And during your speech, you recounted these things that you were talking about, and also the fact that you're tired, that you said, of bringing little white coffins to the cemetery of children and so on. And so, at a certain point, I asked him, but what can we do? How can we intervene? How important is school? And how school is so important? He said, but no, we need to get there first. We need to get them to them before school. And then Maurizio, you said, we need to get there first, which means intervening on the family first thing, which you said. And the second was, use this expression, we need to form the educators. We need to educate the educators. So I would like you to help us understand, what does this mean, that this getting there first on the family and on the educators. So you explained that if we get after the criminality has happened with organised crime, they could already have got them, these kids.
Davanti a voi.
So, there's a priest and someone who works for the government here. We're hearing from me first. Someone doesn't go to the judge's office, to the prosecutors, if you've already not been charged with something. I think about the last femicide there was in the province of Salerno a few days ago. This lady who was strangled by this man who deluded that he loved her. They've left 3 kids behind, we've reflected too little on the children of femicides. Try and think about how many there are in Italy. Even in the last 10 years, there's loads, and they've been wounded in such a grave manner. You know, it's normal these days that the public prosecution happens later, but we need to come first, and it's a great, disillusionment when I hear this same thing over and over again. But I'm not convinced. We can't have one policeman behind everyone. It's delusion. It's impossible. We have something more than a policeman. We have it 24 hours a day with us. Call it whatever you like. Call it a conscience. Call it whatever you like. We need to act on this. Because if it's true that no child is born evil, and I believe that wholeheartedly, none of us are born evil. I'm a parish priest in a difficult area in Caivano. In the past 20 years, we've had more than 20 murders, 4 or 5, even in front of the parish. Now, I remember those kids perfectly well, kids who were there looking at those dead bodies, looking at people who'd been killed on the ground in a pool of blood. And in this neighborhood, 3 priests come out of this neighborhood who are now the three parish priests who are preaching the gospel, plus another dozen who came from other villages. But from this neighborhood, and in this neighborhood now, we have Adriano, who in these days is writing his thesis, because he graduated with hundreds of difficulties. But the environment has an effect. We shouldn't say that your environment determines something, but it has an impact. We can say something, we can do something. We need to first of all convince ourselves. I'm saying this now, us adults who, we're adults now. The kids, they don't, listen to our speeches that much, because no one really believes in our homilies anymore. You guys, who of you believe in the priest's homily anymore? I always say that when I start my homily. Be patient. For me, I have to give a homily. The church says I have to. So don't get too bored, because if you get bored, I'll get bored. Let's help each other out a bit. Let's have an act of charity for each other. I won't get bored, and you won't get bored. But the fathers of the church said, what is it that closes the mouth of the preacher? And it's sin. Think about it. If your parish priest is stingy, let's give a concrete example. If your parish priest is stingy, pay attention. Think about his homilies for a whole year, and in a whole year, tell me if he's ever spoken about stinginess, about avarice, about generosity, about opening your heart, about providence, about saying, don't worry, you won't die in a hospice, don't worry. Let's see if this has happened. Let's take another example. Think about if your parish priest, if he's decided that he wants to be the bishop. He said, sorry, I'm speaking for myself, I'm not speaking for you, you're all saints, but if your parish priest has got in his head that he wants to be the bishop, and he says, being a minister of the church is what he wants to do. If he wants to do it, well, because he wants it, not because I want it. I don't know if I'm explaining myself properly here. He won't ever speak, because, as far as regards me, I'm talking about priests because I'm a priest, so I don't want to talk about anyone else, but this also refers to you, adults, parents, when regarding children. Let's give an even more silly example. With Domenico, we've seen each other many times in schools to talk to students. Great. Well, guys, I've been working in a hospital for 10 years. I'm the head of the ward, and that Caivano has become the epicenter of that which is a high level of death. There's lots and lots of deaths, lots and lots of cancer in our area. and many people have been died of cancer, and including kids. And this is what it really struck me for the rest of my life, seeing all those small white coffins. But it's become the land of fire, they call it, because things burn, and they burn because they're it's not of the houses or whatever, but it's the it's industry that burns illegally, things that don't want to pay the taxes. There's the north of Italy that ships its rubbish to the south. You know, I'm sure you guys personally aren't responsible, but many of many of the people who live next to you have done it. You know, we've come to what we've come to, but this is an external situation, and you know, we can do something about it, but so we can do much more. For example, about smoking cigarettes. You know, when I go to schools now, you know, I say, come here, please. Do any of you have a packet of cigarettes? And someone says yes, and I say, come here. Do you know how to read? Yes. Read what it says here. Smoking is bad for your health. You know, turn the packet around. What does it say there? Smoking contains more than 70 carcinogens. Turn the packet again. Smoking kills. Stop smoking. You know, how much does this pack of cigarettes cost? €5. How many do you smoke a day? One a day. For 30 days, it's €150. You know, I say well, I'll translate. Are you all right in the head? You spend 150 quid a month to get cancer. Well, come on. Do you have the courage to do it? Go on, you could be free now. Let's take this packet of cigarettes. Let's stamp all over it, and you'll be free. And many of them do it, and many of them don't do it. Question, you know, these are kids. Who's the father who can say with strength to their son, look, that, you know, this is the journey. It's the father who doesn't smoke. Because if the father smokes, he'll say it, but his words have no strength behind them. Because the son will say to the father, Dad, sorry, but if smoking's bad, why don't you stop? Why do you want to, you know, kill my father? And if it's bad, then if it's not bad, why are you telling me that? You know, moving on to the speech. You know, the alcohol age has been reducing constantly. I think we're at roughly 11 or 12 here, but you know, at that age, all it takes is to getting drunk once, and it can have life-changing damage. Who can have this discussion with great seriousness? The father who doesn't drink, but if dad does drink, then this, then telling them this loses strength. Think about giving a talk about drugs. And so, you know, this seems a bit too moralistic. Well, maybe it can be, I guess. You know, look, I'm not saying it's not, but the gospel is helpful to me here because I'm convinced that if we were able to make a person fall in love with the idea of good, to make them enamored with beauty, if we talk to them with passion, you know, if we say, I'm the child of illiterate parents, but I had a teacher who, you know, in the third grade at high school, he made me memorize the Divine Comedy, and I still remember it. And I bless my teacher 1,000 times for doing that. And I've also had teachers who, you know, they'd yawn in class. You've had them too. First, you know, they'd yawn in class, and then, you know, then they'd arrive. The yawn would arrive in the classroom before they did. And, you know, and this is a question of passion here, you know, and the life of faith is something similar. You know, we're Christians, we're Catholics, yes, but many of us pray less. Some go to Mass. Some go to Mass every Sunday. Some go to Mass when it happens. Some go to Mass at Easter and at Christmas. You know, you know better than me that for everything we need a justification, a reason to do so, because it's not necessarily about doing something, it's about finding a reason to do it. So, you know, it's important up until a certain point. And if our young person who's breathing in all that sees that we believe in it, then they'll get to they'll go through some certain the years of adolescence that are difficult, but this but what you've said to them will stick with them, and it might come out later. But if they've not had this instruction from their parents, then I ask later, what is it that will come out from their lives? Remember that this outside world, it really bombards. It really bombards. And sometimes we have to tell the truth. Poor kids, man. They've been more unlucky than us. We perhaps had less, less comfort. Maybe we had less, but it was less comfortable. But our lives were more simple. It was a train that glided along its tracks. That had. Whereas these days, you need a magic word that we, sometimes with a verb that we need to learn to conjugate. And this is I think it's, discerning. The verb is a verb to discern, to understand from time to time how to intervene and with what strengths to intervene, how often, knowing that our kids really are bombarded on all sides. And so I say to you, if at school, or outside our house, there's a world that we don't know, because the world of the friends of our children, we don't really know it. If they've always got this device here 24/7, I say it's the genie. Whatever you ask it, it will give you. It's almost like your fairy godmother. And if we lose our strength in what we believe in, and what these kids will we see it. They get aggressive. They lack values. They need to be, for the love of God, But we need to help them before they fall into any traps. You've seen over this last guy. He wasn't even a kid. He was 27. That they found dead in front of the computer with a gas mask on his head. Guys, come on, calm down. We need to come first. Let's get there first. What are we talking about? When I hear talking about the laws. We could multiply the laws forever, and I don't think that the laws will any law will solve our problems. Sometimes we need to tell ourselves the truth. It's not that we're lacking laws, we're lacking common sense on behalf of adults, but also a bit, a bit of common sense more wouldn't hurt. So before I hinted to the fact that the park in Caivano was the biggest drug peddling place in all of Europe, but that was before. Now I'd like Don Patriciello to tell us what happened, even because about his initiatives. It's thanks to his initiatives that things have changed. Don't we all three of us have to talk here? Yeah, you tell us now, and then we'll move on to the others. Well, what can I say? I'm a parish priest in a very particular place. In 1980, we had a terrible earthquake in Campania. There were more than 3,000 dead people. Naples didn't have so many deaths, but had a lot of problems. And as such, the people from the poorest neighborhoods, and here we're getting a bit political, not only in the sense of party politics, but political in the sense that, there were some grave errors, some really cataclysmic errors we made there. Once an error is made, the consequences don't happen. They don't happen immediately. They happen, diluted over time. So what happened? They took all the poor people and all the poorest neighborhoods of Naples, and they sent them all to one single place. And thus these ghetto quarters were created. Now they complain because there are these ghetto neighborhoods I'll ask you sorry straight away to all the architects. If there are any architects here, I say, sorry if there's any politicians here. After all this, I'll say we should send all the architects who planned these neighborhoods to prison. We should send them to prison straight away, all of them. With the permission of the public prosecutor here. How can you think to make so many boxes in one place, to mass so many poor people, people of all the poorest neighborhoods of Naples, and take people from all these poor neighborhoods, and then the state simply leaves and ignores them. I repeat to you this phrase, it was the TV and the newspapers reported it, but hearing the governor of my region who says to Caivano, the state isn't there, full stop, that's the statement that gave me goosebumps. What does it mean? Sorry, my mum can say that the state is absent in Caivano, full stop. I can say that because I'm a priest, a parish priest, that the state's not here, because it's true that the state isn't here, and full stop. But the governor of the region can't say that. Surely not. What game are we playing here? Sorry. And so, this neighborhood was built, and then the state really did just leave. It's crazy. The state just left. You were asking me earlier, how many years have you been there? How on earth can I leave? I'll never ask to leave there. How can I leave too? If even if the bishop forces me, sure, I'll go, but I'll never ask to leave. The state left. When the cats are out, the mice come out to play, and obviously this neighborhood became the greatest place of drug smuggling in Europe. Obviously, some people have gotten quite rich from this in an incredible way, and then don't get too shocked by this. Domenico, I need to say this. I'm an Italian of the South. I'm Neapolitan. Down to my core. But, we need to have the courage to say things. There's not much else. We need to have the courage to say things. You may think it's difficult in this moment. Until a few years ago, the Camorra, the mafia, had at least for 400 euros a month to some poor people. The council house is owned by the council, and if that doesn't shock you, then I'm sorry, but what on earth could shock us more than that? What could shock you more than that? How did this happen? It happened because many people left. The gangs, in inverted commas, bought. They possessed they took over these flats, these council houses, without any official documents, because that's property of the council. But then when they went to the council to ask for the residency, the council should have declared to the public prosecutor, but no, for a question of politics, of votes, and this and that, and of fear, and of the mafia, and these people found themselves, having dozens of apartments that they started subletting to poor people for 400 a month. I'm a priest. I don't know if Francesco knows better, but you hear, Francesco? I'm talking to you, Francesco. Francesco Nibene is a big guy in Avellino, and anytime I write, he publishes me in Avellino, and out of pity, I get myself published by him. How can we be silent in front of this? How can I, content myself with celebrating mass and saying the rosary and then being quiet? How can I, bless a kid in a coffin, and then the next 2 days another coffin, and then after a month another coffin, and not ask myself, what on earth is happening in this land? Well, here it is, my friends. This is it. I find everything in the gospel. Be patient. you know, you must have you must have an illness. You know, sure, I'm a priest, I know what's wrong with me, but I find everything in the gospel. Because if I reread carefully, even calmly, the gospel with regard, as opposed to a few years ago, I do realize that it's useless to just circle around the issue. You know, Jesus told to love God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind, and with all our strength, to love Him passionately, and to love Him, without shame, to talk about Him without shame at the bar, in your workplace, to your kids, to talk about Him with great peace and tranquility. But this commandment could have been a great delusion if it hadn't translated into love for another, loving another, your neighbor as yourself. What does it mean to love your neighbor? To give him a hug. To what does it mean? This morning I got a voice message from an old lady who's in the hospital right now. She's on a gurney, recovering on a gurney because there's not enough space in the ward. She said, "Father, please tell whoever's in charge. It's not this gurney I'm sat on. It's that there's not even a toilet here in the corridor where they've put me." I'm not making anything up. I can show you the message now if you want, but I can. No one's ever seen God, and if I'm wrong about God, someone told me if I'm wrong, I'll be wrong about everything. If this evening we're wrong about God, we risk being wrong about everything. And what's the proof? You'll never convince me if you try and show me with your arms raised, or be careful. You see at a parish where the young people pray with their arms raised. It's a consolation for the heart here. I'll say that now. You've still not convinced me. You've still not convinced me. You'll convince me when you can show me that your brother is worth it to you. And not in the holidays or in the at Christmas. If you're a doctor, I'll look at you while you're a doctor. I'll watch you. If you're a politician, are you serving the interests of the poor? Are you serving the interests of your family? But is it this political charism is translated from father to son? It's inherited from father to son. It's a question I'm asking myself. Is this really what's happening? Do you remember Don Milani when Francuccio went to tell him? And Don Milano said to Francuccio, "You've made me do something that I would never have done myself. I've gone to ask for advice to you because I would never have done it otherwise. Never, but I had to. But for love for you, sometimes being a Christian is contradictory. But always for love, and sometimes for loving you more, I've loved God less. But God doesn't pay attention to these small things. Do you see? So here we go. I say to you now, we talk about the education of kids and of young people, but think about these kids that are seeing every day, every evenings, every day. They're thinking about, when we studied in school, we asked ourselves, but how could it happen? All everything that happened, 80 years ago. Matt, where were our grandparents, our parents? What happened? And now it's happening, beneath our eyes. It's happening before our eyes, and every day. The last boat that sank in Lampedusa, only half the people aboard were half the people only half were saved. The rest were just bodies. you know, they were buried without a photo, without a story, without a name. The others weren't even rescued. You know, it makes me feel sick. I'm from Naples, and I like Naples. I like fish from the sea a lot, and you know, I'm getting nauseous even about eating fish from the sea, and I'm thinking that these fish are nourishing themselves from our brothers here. You know, saying these things, we've gotten into the habit of just saying these things, and our kids, you know, how can we educate them if they see that adults never stop? There's such damage. They hurt each other. They you know, the person further north to us has stopped. The person further south, they don't stop. They don't stop. And they carry on and carry on. It's terrible. It's terrible. You know, he says, fathers, you know, so we need to recover something, that the sanctuary of our home, really, guys. If I had to say, you know, something practical, something snappy, I'd say, be careful to you know, recover the sanctuary of your home. Let's pay a special attention to this sanctuary in our home. Let's be careful with how we talk to our kids, how we write about on this beloved social media. You know, if you're not saying something helpful, then why on earth are you writing it? You know, a few days ago, I was speaking to a friend, and I was saying that I hope that our social media the comments should be paid, that you have to pay €1 to leave a comment. That would be a great thing. So much badness would leave this world. So much evil would disappear, really. And, you know, just because it's such a particularly difficult moment, you know, we need to do whatever we can. We need to teach, to instruct in the best way we can this sanctuary of our homes, and care for it and nurture it and defend our children and help them and give them this experience that will help them in future. You know, dress them with this armor. And, you know, if you're Christians, if you're Catholics, you know, I think most of you probably are, don't force them to go to Mass, invite them to come. You know, show them that you believe in the Mass. Don't force them to pray, invite them to pray. But show them that you believe in prayer. Before, you know, taking a bite to eat, if we stop for 5 seconds and we say a prayer, we say, thank you for this bread that you've given us. It's 5 seconds. That's perhaps the 5 most important seconds in the lives of our child. Do it. From this evening, do it. Make you be shown sometimes kneeling. Make sure they see you kneeling beside the bed sometimes. Don't say anything. Make sure that when your kids open the doors and they see you on your knees saying, "Oh, sorry, I was praying." These images, they'll never forget them. My mother died very early, when I was young. She had a heart attack, but I've always remembered a lady who every night before bed would stop and pray.
Cesana,
Giancarlo. To say yes, yes, no, no, we need to call things with their own name, beyond slogans, let's say. The things that this characterizes the work of Tempi, we say. It's a slogan we use. So, to use a phrase that was very clear, very dear to Don Jus, what does it mean to give a judgment? Because very often this world is confused with another one, which is the word opinion. These are two different things. Yep. I'll start from so we've heard very dramatic situations here. I'll speak from a different point of view, for something a bit more usual, a bit more common. That's still dramatic, I think, but more normal, if you like. My wife, before she died, she had built up a centre for so-called fragile youngsters. A pair of them we brought into our home, and others were fostered with friends. So maybe a dozen of them in a couple of rooms in an apartment that we'd rented. And now there's 550 of them of all types. There's immigrants, people with problems, people who couldn't manage to finish school, youngsters have been sent before the courts, etc. You must realize when the teachers in this centre that also has a school, when they go into class, they find these kids in front of them, and they must somehow manage to speak, because they don't listen to them. If they invite them to go to work, they won't come. So they go and fetch them and take them to the workplace. They try to correct certain behaviors, including drug dealing, but it's extremely difficult. And so these teachers who are young, because this is a centre that it's now helped a bit more than before, but previously it was self-financing. So it wasn't able to pay teachers like the state school does. So only youngsters come, and young teachers who are looking for work, and we employ them, and they need to face this situation, which is a challenge. They need to be educators, and this is very difficult. And we have monthly meetings and everybody talks of this difficulty. But this education is the most difficult road there is. There's nothing as complex as this. It's not by chance that Giussani says that if you can be involved in education. And so what do they need to decide, these teachers? They need to decide where their hope is placed. In what do they hope in front of these kids? And then they must hope in their freedom. They must take positions on what freedom is. There are some very confused ideas, because freedom for many means doing what we want. Instead, freedom can't be that, because nobody can do what they want in absolute terms. You can do what you can in some of the time, but not always. And so at the end, life finishes badly because you die. And so you can't do what you want to. And so what is freedom? It's what we say normally it's the expression of a series of chemical reactions, and so either a yes or a no comes out. And so you say yes to the teacher or not, or is it something else? Is it a purely psychological fact, a consequence of the behavior, a consequence of how your brain functions? So it's like being a doctor. Can you adjust heads that aren't working right, or is it something else, or is it the spirit, the soul, the attention to the infinite that not even the priests speak about anymore, the attention that isn't measurable towards destiny, and so the capacity and the desire to recognize the truth. If we don't think about this, how can you educate? How can you do a proposal? How can you insist on a proposal? So this is the problem of education. Because education you find in front of the heart of a person. Like the Bible says, the heart of man is an abyss. In the heart of man, there's good, but there's also evil. And education is to bring out the good, to make the good emerge. But this is a battle, this is a war. Because these kids, they weren't only abandoned by the state, they were abandoned by their mum and dad, by their teachers, by the judges. They're abandoned. There's nobody who loves them. This is the problem. Which is true for us too, because if we're not teachers in a special school, then we're parents, we're companions, we're colleagues, we're people who try to educate themselves, who need to correct themselves. And so education is this choice for freedom. Cesana once said, "I've bet everything on freedom." What does he mean? What did he want? Those are expecting that they're all waiting for them to do what he said? Not at all. To bet everything on freedom is to insist on a proposal, because the disaster of young people, the confusion, I don't know whether it's a disaster, but the confusion of young people is the hesitation to depends fundamentally on one thing, because not that youngsters are good necessarily, because we're all born with the original sin. People can be bad, can do bad, and so we're all born with something crooked inside, with poison in us, a possibility to poison our lives. So it's not that everybody's good a priori, but it's not. There's not a rule that if you're naughty or if you're disobedient at school, if what the papers call you as this sort of emergency of youth. Their fragility is the uncertainty of adults, because according to what Lily said first, and this thing of Tempi, yes, yes, no, no, because Jesus says in the Gospel of St. Matthew, when you speak, say yes, yes, no, no, because all the rest comes from the evil one. Be simple. And I once asked Don just, how do I be simple? He said to me, you need to be decisive. You need to cut. You need to decide from which part you start, because in life you need to decide from which part you start, from which side you are. We need to decide to whom we belong. That's the substance. In the book which Giancarlo published recently, there's a whole part about education, and there's a passage that's really interesting, because in some articles that came out in a scientific magazine, in Nature, in which they speak of young people, and particularly of young people's problems, and you commenting on these articles in the book, you'd said that the thing that struck you was that all of this data that these studies on young people bring out, and they're terrible information, 13% of people between around 19 years old have a diagnosis of mental disorders. These are the numbers that were coming out in these studies. And you, Giancarlo, you commenting on it in the book, you say that the thing that strikes me is that the solution which is given to this problem is always a solution that it's scientific, it's chemical. It's like finding the way to resolve this disease, which is often an existential disease, so to speak. And as you say, it's as if people are talking like lab rats. So there was no reference to any important content. You say faith, reason, freedom, these things you're saying now. In particular, I've always heard you insisting on a particular word, linked to the word judgment, calling the things with their names, which was the question of affection. You always said that a judgment can never be detached, let's say, from a motion of affection to what's in front of you. Because when you express a judgment, as just as it is condemning, killing the thing in front of you. You can say even the right word, but at the end, it doesn't help the one you have in front of you to come out of, to be educated. So what is this affection? This affection with this judgment with affection. So about these articles of Nature, which is a scientific magazine that's very important, one of the most important, certainly, where substantially they take young people's troubles, starting from a bunch of pronouncements, maybe from UNESCO, etc., that say, meanwhile, mental disturbances often happen in young people, that they're frequent in young people because it's the time of development, it's the most fragile time that there's. And so the schizophrenia is called precocious dementia because it happens above all or it's born in adolescence. So I said, UNESCO says that even being mental disturbances are distributed highly in the young people, only a third of the funds of research, of psychiatric research, is invested there. And then they start to study it. They report some studies that's of those who are involved in this and this fragility of young people. And at the end, they say, we don't understand it really well. A year later, Nature did another issue where they put together the use of social media, above all phones, which is a widespread worry, with the trouble of young people, which can bring them as far as suicide, because suicide in young people in Western Europe and in America is the second highest cause of death, suicide. And so they measured the time passed in front of, on the social and mental disturbances, and they didn't find anything there. So what struck me is that these have studied this phenomenon of development, etc., without taking any notice of the words that we were saying before, like no one spoke to them of faith, of freedom, of truth, of reason, and above all of affection. There's no education, affective education, because without affection, what do you have? Affection means being struck by something. If you're struck by something, then the others are struck by you, and this is affection. It means being linked, being bound. And nobody speaks to them of this. So these people, they put themselves to study the kids as if they were white rats in the lab, without intervening, without wondering about who said things to them. Well, is this science? Is this science? Meanwhile, affection is this ability to bind yourself, to tie yourself, not just to see things, but to link yourself to these true things. Because Jesus, he did miracles. He brought the dead back to life. He made the lame walk. He gave the blind to see. He let the deaf hear. After 3 years, they put him on a cross. They weren't bound to him. They didn't link themselves to him. They understood that they were right, but that they did not have this affection. So if you see something true, and you don't link yourself to it, then the truth is nothing for you. It doesn't help you in any way. Giussani, many of you might remember when he gave the example of Chernobyl, when there was the radiation leak, and he said, speaking to a group of university students, he said, "You youngsters, you're informed. You're in good form. You're intelligent. You're handsome. You're better than we were. But it's as if you have inside yourself an illness that has entered into your bones. You don't have affective energy. You're not able to form bonds. And you teach this. This can be taught. You teach it with the insistence, with proposals, with the constant being close to them, with loving. Otherwise, how can one manage? How can you learn this by yourself? So these kids, how can they get affection? How can they have affection if they don't find anybody who has affection for them? Luigi Amicone loved to quote this verse of Shakespeare in the Midsummer Night's Dream, when at a certain point one of the characters, a faun, who says that it's not enough to speak, let's time to speak seriously. So this seriously, Gigi always said, it doesn't mean heavily, if you like, or in a preachy kind of tone, in a boring way, but it means seriously. It means expressing a judgment. But as Cesana, as Giancarlo said, also Airoma and Patriciello testified to us, to express a judgment, you need to live it. You need to make experience of a truth, of a positive, of what's good, of something positive that's convincing in life, and then one can communicate it to others. If we don't express these judgments that start from a lived life, then the desert spreads, to follow the title of the meeting. So let's thank our three guests again. And I'm just left with the job of giving two notices. The first is to sustain the meeting. You all know by now how to do it. There are many donor aura points around. The second is a slightly personal one, in which case I invite you all to subscribe to Tempi. The important thing is to pay the subscription to Tempi. Good evening all, and thank you, and have a good meeting.
Questo è un luogo che genera dialogo,
Qualcuno che si impegna, che si batte.
che approfondisce la conoscenza e sostiene la fiducia. È un crocevia dove si incontra chi desidera il vero, il bello, il giusto e il bene. È una testimonianza di speranza nel cuore ferito del presente. E tutto questo
Proporre con la propria vita.
esiste anche grazie a te.
Vi prego, vi imploro, con umiltà e con fiducia, permettete a Cristo di parlare all'uomo.
Don Gius aveva capito il problema che avevo. Se la tua vocazione è vero, il tuo lavoro verrà fuori anche dai sassi.
Di comunicare la fede agli altri, ma veramente insieme a loro riscoprire che cos'è la fede, che cos'è la fede per me. Portare Cristo agli altri, comunicarlo agli altri, è l'unico modo che abbiamo per conoscerlo veramente.
L'iter communionis aiuta a comunicare all'esterno la ricchezza di vita, di giudizi, di tentativi, di opere che nascono dalle persone e dalle comunità. L'iter communionis è proprio la vita del movimento. Scrivete all'iter communionis le vostre esperienze, ci fate bene.
Vi prego, vi imploro, con umiltà e con fiducia, permettete a Cristo di parlare all'uomo.
Don Gius aveva capito il problema che avevo. Se la tua vocazione è vero, il tuo lavoro verrà fuori anche dai sassi.
Di comunicare la fede agli altri, ma veramente insieme a loro riscoprire che cos'è la fede, che cos'è la fede per me. Portare Cristo agli altri, comunicarlo agli altri, è l'unico modo che abbiamo per conoscerlo veramente.
L'iter communionis aiuta a comunicare all'esterno la ricchezza di vita, di giudizi, di tentativi, di opere che nascono dalle persone e dalle comunità. L'iter communionis è proprio la vita del movimento. Scrivete all'iter communionis le vostre esperienze, ci fate bene.